May 4, 1945. The air over the Elbe River Valley is thick with the scent of pine needles, diesel exhaust, and the lingering metallic tang of spent artillery shells. In a makeshift German field hospital established within the crumbling walls of a former secondary school, the atmosphere is suffocating. There is no electricity, only the flickering rhythmic pulse of guttering candles that cast long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The silence in the hallways is not peaceful. It is a heavy, anxious void punctuated by the low, rhythmic moaning of men for whom the morphine ran out 3 days ago. Among the shadows, a young German nurse named Greta moves with the mechanical precision of the exhausted. Her uniform, once a crisp and disciplined gray, is now a map of desperate labor, stained with the dried rust of blood and the gray dust of masonry. Her hands are raw from scrubbing floorboards with sand and cold water, the only cleaning agents left in the Reich's dwindling arsenal. Every few minutes, she pauses to listen. The distant, rolling thunder of the front lines has been replaced by something more terrifying, the high-pitched whine of approaching gasoline engines. These are not the heavy, lumbering growls of Tiger tanks, but the nimble, aggressive purr of American jeeps. To Greta and her sisters in the wards, this sound is the herald of a nightmare. 4 years, the propaganda of the Ministry of Public Enlightenment had painted a vivid, terrifying portrait of the coming occupation. They expected the Amos to arrive as a horde of uncultured looters, a disorganized mass of gangsters who would strip the hospital of its last dignity. The nurses had heard stories of vengeance, of mass deportations, and of the systematic starvation that followed a conquered people. They gripped their silver crucifixes and their meager supplies of bandages, waiting for the doors to be kicked in by men who knew only destruction. Instead, the school's heavy oak doors are pushed open with a firm but measured weight. The sunlight that pours into the dim hallway is blinding, illuminating the thick swirl of dust motes. A group of men in olive drab enters, their boots clicking sharply against the tile. They do not shout. They do not fire into the ceiling. They move with a terrifying, quiet confidence. These are men who have traveled across an ocean, bringing with them a logistical tale that spans half the globe, and they carry themselves with the casual ease of those who have already won. As the American medical officers begin their sweep of the facility, the contrast is immediate and jarring. The Germans look upon them not as monsters, but as something far more confusing, a vision of impossible health and vitality. The Americans are tall, their skin clear, their uniforms made of high-quality wool that has never known the bite of ersatz fabric. They carry silver-colored tools and strange, olive-painted boxes that hum with an internal life. Greta watches from the corner of a ward, her heart hammering against her ribs, as a young American medic approaches a row of wounded soldiers. He doesn't reach for a bayonet or a set of shackles. Instead, he reaches for a metallic canteen hanging from his belt, and the sound it makes, a sharp, musical clink of something solid hitting the inner walls, sends a ripple of confusion through the room. To understand the depth of Greta's shock, one must understand the state of the German medical machine in the spring of 1945. The German Red Cross, or Deutsches Rotes had once been the pride of the continent, a disciplined corps of nurses and doctors who followed the Wehrmacht across Europe. But by the time the Allies reached the Elbe, the system had been hollowed out by years of total war. The ideology of the Third Reich demanded that every resource be funneled into the front-line combat units, leaving the medical infrastructure to survive on remnants. Nurses were forced to wash and reuse paper bandages. Surgeons operated with dulling scalpels and utilized sawdust to soak up blood on the floors. This was the era of ersatz, substitute goods. The coffee was made of roasted acorns, the fuel was distilled from coal, and the medicines were often nothing more than placebos or herbal tinctures. The German people had been told that this sacrifice was necessary to defeat the materialist powers of the West. propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had consistently characterized the United States as a nation of shallow, decadent consumers who possessed wealth but lacked the spiritual will of the German soldier. The German medical staff believed that while the Americans might have more trucks, they lacked the grit to endure a true struggle. They expected a clash of cultures where German stoicism would eventually outshine American excess. However, the reality of the American arrival shattered this narrative before a single word was exchanged. The Americans did not arrive in rags or showing the signs of a long, grueling campaign. Their presence was defined by an almost offensive level of preparation. Factual records from the period describe the astonishment of German personnel as they watched the U.S. Army Medical Corps set up shop. The Americans possessed a logistical tale that allowed them to move entire hospitals on wheels. They brought with them portable X-ray machines, refrigerated units for blood plasma, and a seemingly endless supply of penicillin, a miracle drug that the German doctors had only heard of in hushed, envious whispers. For Greta, the background of the war had always been one of shrinking horizons and growing darkness. In her mind, the war was a tunnel that grew narrower and colder with every passing month. But as she stood in that hallway, watching the Americans unload crates marked with the bold white stencil of the U.S. Army, the horizon suddenly exploded. These men were not just soldiers. They were the representatives of a system that viewed the impossible as a standard operating procedure. They didn't just bring soldiers to the fight, they brought a civilization. The clinking sound from the canteen, the sharp, percussive ring of ice hitting metal, was the first note in a symphony of abundance that Greta was not yet ready to comprehend. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in a war zone, a sound that belonged to a world of peace and prosperity that the German people had been told was a lie. The context of their struggle was being rewritten in real time by the casual clink of a frozen cube. The moment of surrender felt less like a climax and more like a slow, heavy descent into the unknown. As the American medical officers fanned out through the school corridors, the German nurses stood in rigid formation, their backs against the cold plaster walls. Greta felt a prickle of sweat at her hairline despite the damp chill of the ward. This was the transition they had been warned about, the moment the civilized world of the Reich was handed over to the primitive victors from across the sea. Every rustle of a map, every click of an American safety latch, felt like a prelude to an atrocity. The nurses had tucked away small razors and cyanide capsules, prepared for a fate they believed was inevitable. However, the expected violence never materialized. Instead, the surrender was marked by a clinical, almost unnerving efficiency. An American captain with a caduceus pinned to his collar stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced detachment of a man accustomed to triage. He did not look at the nurses with the lust or hatred they had been taught to expect. He looked at them as exhausted resources that needed to be integrated into a superior system. The American soldiers moved among the German wounded with a strange, easy-going discipline, handing out cigarettes and white bread that smelled of sugar rather than sawdust. The emotional contrast was staggering. 4 months, the nurses had been the sole wall between their patients and the grave, working until their eyes were bloodshot and their minds went numb. They expected the Americans to be a disruptive force, a storm that would blow through and leave only ruins. Instead, the Americans brought an immediate, overwhelming sense of order. They set up folding tables, established clean zones, and began to categorize the patients with a speed that left the German staff dazed. The nurses found themselves being directed, not dragged. They were told to continue their duties, but with a caveat: they were now under the authority of the United States Army. As Greta watched a group of GIs carry in a heavy, insulated chest, she realized that her fear was being replaced by a profound, gnawing curiosity. These men did not act like conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not take, they provided. They were the masters of a machine that seemed to generate solutions out of thin air. In the corner of the ward, an American medic unscrewed the cap of a large, olive-drab thermos. As he poured a clear liquid into a metal cup, the sound reached Greta's ears again, the sharp, unmistakable clink of ice. It was a sound that defied the reality of a collapsed nation, a sound that suggested that for the Americans, even the heat of a European summer could be conquered by a simple act of logistics. The capture was complete, but the true invasion, the psychological dismantling of their world, was only just beginning. The nurses watched from the dim recesses of the ward as the American logistical machine truly began to breathe. It was not just the movement of men, but a rhythmic mechanical hum that settled over the captured school. Outside, heavy 6x6 GMC trucks, the deuce and a half, backed into the courtyard with a high-pitched chirp of pneumatic brakes. Unlike the German supply columns, which by 1945 were often reduced to horse-drawn carts or desperate men scavenging for wood gas fuel, the Americans moved with a surplus of energy that bordered on the surreal. They were the masters of a motorized symphony, bringing with them a technological prowess that felt like science fiction to the starving medical staff. The sound of efficiency was most pronounced in the arrival of the portable refrigeration units. Greta stood by a dusty window, watching as two GIs wrestled a boxy, vibrating machine from the tailgate of a truck. It was painted the same dull olive drab as everything else, but it hummed with a deep, throbbing power that vibrated through the floorboards. In the Third Reich, refrigeration had become a luxury of the high command or the most advanced laboratories in Berlin. Here, in a muddy field in the middle of a collapsing front, the Americans were deploying it as if it were as common as a rifle. The mechanical growl of the compressor was a constant reminder that the victors did not just fight the war, they powered it. Inside the hospital, the nurses noticed a change in the sensory landscape. The heavy, sweet smell of gangrene and unwashed bodies began to be countered by the sharp, clean scent of chemicals and the metallic tang of new equipment. The Americans began to unroll miles of field telephone wire, connecting the school to a global network of command. But through all this activity, one sound rose above the rest, becoming the rhythmic heartbeat of the American occupation, the clatter of ice being shoveled into insulated bins. It was a percussive, crystalline sound, sharp, brittle, and undeniably loud in the quiet of the ward. To the German nurses, who had spent the last 2 years scavenging for enough coal just to keep the operating theater above freezing, the idea of energy being used to create cold was an affront to their understanding of reality. They watched as the Americans used ice not just for medical preservation, but for comfort. It was the ultimate expression of industrial surplus. To have enough power to fight across the Atlantic, to push through the Siegfried Line, and still have enough leftover energy to freeze water into cubes for a thirsty soldier. It was a logistical flex that spoke louder than any artillery barrage. The clinking of those cubes was the sound of a nation that had so much abundance it could afford to be frivolous with the laws of nature. It was the sound of a machine that never slept, a machine that was systematically cooling the fever of a broken continent. The factual records of the era reveal a staggering disparity between the two warring medical worlds. While the German medical system had been reduced to a primitive, scavenged existence, the American Army Medical Department operated with a budget and supply chain that eclipsed the entire pre-war German economy. In the wards of the captured school, this gap was manifest in every object. The German nurses looked on in stunned silence as American medics opened sterilized, green-painted crates to reveal mountains of gauze, surgical silk, and rows of glass vials that caught the light like jewels. One particular recorded observation from a German surgeon captured in the sector noted that the Americans used more morphine in a single afternoon than his entire division had received in the final 6 months of the war. But it wasn't just the quantity. It was the quality of care that stemmed from such surplus. The Americans brought with them a standardized system of treatment, the first of its kind in history, where every wounded man, regardless of rank, received the same high-level interventions. While the German nurses had spent years prioritizing valuable soldiers due to scarcity, the Americans treated the human body as a machine that simply required the right parts and the right fuel to restart. The contrast reached its peak in the kitchen and the pantry. The German nurses had been surviving on bread cut with sawdust and a thin, watery soup made from dehydrated vegetables. Now they watched as GIs unloaded crates of C rations and K rations, containing chocolate bars, canned meats, and real fruit juices. The Americans were not just well supplied, they were oversupplied. They had enough to share, and they did so with a casualness that was deeply unsettling to the disciplined German mind. To the Americans, these items were standard. To the Germans, they were miracles. This abundance served as a form of logistical trauma for the captured staff. It forced them to confront the fact that they had been fighting a war they were never meant to win. The German army had fought with the desperation of the doomed, but the American army fought with the confidence of the wealthy. The nurses saw that the Americans didn't just have better weapons, they had a better way of sustaining life. Every time a fresh crate of supplies was cracked open with a crowbar, the sound echoed through the halls like a gavel. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered. The Reich had failed because it could not provide for its own, while the democracy across the sea had arrived with so much surplus that even its waste was more valuable than the German treasury. The disparity was no longer a matter of military strategy. It was a fundamental difference in the value placed on the individual and the resources used to keep that individual alive. The moment of transformation occurred not during an interrogation or a lecture, but through a simple act of hospitality that defied the laws of wartime probability. Greta stood near the center of the ward, her hands folded over her apron, watching as an American sergeant approached her. He did not bark an order or demand a salute. Instead, he held out a heavy, sweat-slicked canteen cup. The exterior of the metal was beaded with condensation, fat, clear droplets that rolled down the sides like tears of joy. To a woman who had spent years in a world where cold meant a lack of fuel and wet meant a leaking roof, the sight of a controlled, intentional chill was mesmerizing. She took the cup with trembling fingers. The physical shock was immediate. The metal was not merely cool, it was biting, an aggressive frost that numbed her fingertips and sent a jolt of electricity through her exhausted nervous system. Inside the water, several jagged, translucent cubes bobbed and spun, clinking against the rim with that same crystalline melody she had heard since the Americans arrived. It was ice. Not the dirty, gray slush scraped from a winter gutter, but clear, pure, manufactured ice. She stared into the cup, seeing her own wide-eyed reflection in the surface of a luxury that had been entirely deleted from the German vocabulary. When she finally tilted the cup to her lips, the sensation was overwhelming. The water was crisp, clean, and impossibly cold, washing away the grit of the dusty school and the metallic aftertaste of the war. It was the taste of a different reality. For years, the German people had been told that victory would be won through the triumph of the will, a spiritual exertion that could overcome material shortages. Yet, here was a common soldier offering her a drink that required an entire industrial civilization to produce. To provide ice water to a prisoner in a combat zone meant the Americans had mastered the sea, the air, and the very energy of the sun. As the cold liquid settled in her stomach, the propaganda of the last decade began to dissolve. The decadent Americans were not weak. They were so strong that they could afford to be comfortable in the middle of a slaughterhouse. They didn't need to be fanatical because they were supported by a machine that turned the elements to its whim. Greta looked at the sergeant, and for the first time, she did not see a conqueror. She saw a man whose society valued the individual enough to ensure that even his water was chilled. The glass of water was a bridge between two worlds, one that demanded suffering as a virtue, and another that viewed abundance as a right. In that single freezing sip, the ideology of the Reich was rendered obsolete, replaced by the undeniable, clinking truth of American logistics. This display of material wealth was not merely an accident of geography or a byproduct of luck, it was the physical manifestation of an ideology. To the Americans, The presence of ice water in a combat zone was a triumph of logistics as a democratic principle. In a totalitarian state, the hierarchy of needs always funnels upward toward the leadership, leaving the common soldier and the frontline nurse to make do with remnants. But in the American model, the logistical chain was designed to push the comforts of home as far forward as possible. This was the arsenal of democracy in its most intimate form, not just the production of B-17 bombers and Sherman tanks, but the mass production of small, individual dignities. The strategic implications of the clinking ice were devastating. If a nation could solve the problem of refrigeration in a war-torn ruin, it could solve any problem. It spoke to a level of industrial coordination that made the German concept of Blitzkrieg look like a desperate, amateurish sprint. The German High Command had relied on lightning-fast strikes because they knew they lacked the deep pockets for a war of attrition. The Americans, conversely, moved with a deliberate, crushing weight. They didn't just outfight their enemies, they outsupplied them until the very idea of resistance became a mathematical impossibility. For the nurses watching the GIs casually refill their cups, the realization was a crushing blow to their nationalist pride. They had been told that democracy was a chaotic, inefficient system that led to weakness and decay. Yet, the evidence before them suggested the opposite. The chaos of a free market had created a supply chain so robust that it could treat a common prisoner to a luxury that the highest-ranking German generals had struggled to secure for their own tables. This was the ideological victory of the West, the proof that a free people, working toward a common goal, could create a level of abundance that made the rigid, controlled economy of the Reich look like a primitive failure. Every clink of the ice served as a psychological wedge, prying the German staff away from their indoctrinated beliefs. They saw that the Americans didn't need to starve their civilians to feed their army. They had enough for everyone. Logistics, in this sense, was the ultimate argument for the American way of life. It was a demonstration of a society that valued the well-being of its people so highly that it would move mountains of ice across an ocean just to provide a moment of respite. The cold water was not just a drink. It was a cold, hard fact of life in a world where freedom and abundance were inextricably linked. The nurses realized that the war had not been lost on the battlefield alone. It had been lost in the factories, the shipping lanes, and the quiet, humming refrigeration units that turned a simple glass of water into a symbol of an unstoppable tide. The shift in the psyche of the captured nurses was not a sudden break, but a steady erosion of everything they had been taught to believe about the world. For years, the National Socialist state had cultivated a cult of hardship, preaching that the Nordic soul was tempered by suffering and that the lack of material comfort was a badge of spiritual superiority. They had been led to believe that the Americans, soft and pampered by their consumerist culture, would crumble when faced with the harsh realities of the European theater. Yet, as the nurses watched these decadent soldiers effortlessly manage a humanitarian crisis with the help of high-tech machinery and limitless supplies, the foundation of their world began to crack. The internal transformation was most evident in the way the nurses began to interact with the American equipment. Greta, who had previously treated her meager German supplies with a desperate holy reverence, found herself overwhelmed by the American attitude toward waste. To the Americans, a bandage used once was discarded, a needle was replaced, not sharpened. This disregard for scarcity was a psychological revelation. It suggested a world where the human being was the precious commodity, and the material was merely a tool to be used and thrown away. The nurses began to see their own past sacrifices not as heroic, but as tragic symptoms of a failed system that had asked them to compensate for its industrial impotence with their own health and sanity. Factual documentation of captured medical personnel often notes a period of profound disorientation following their first exposure to American logistics. This was the shock of realizing that the enemy was not just better armed, but better cared for. The nurses' reflections shifted from fear of their captors to a quiet, burning resentment toward their own leadership. They had been lied to, not just about the outcome of the war, but about the nature of the enemy. The Americans didn't just have more things. They had a different relationship with the concept of life. As the clinking of the ice became a constant background noise in the hospital, a sound as mundane as a ticking clock, it stripped away the last vestiges of the Reich's mythos. The nurses no longer saw the Americans as a threat to civilization. They saw them as the vanguard of a new type of civilization altogether. It was a world where a soldier could reach for a cup of water and find it chilled, even in the middle of a continent reduced to ash. This realization didn't just change their view of the war. It changed their view of what a government owed its people. The clink of the ice was the sound of a promise being kept, a promise that the individual mattered enough to be comforted, even when the world was falling apart. The influence of this encounter rippled outward from the small schoolhouse, spreading through the ranks of the German prisoners of war and the civilian medical staff like a quiet, unstoppable tide. It was not just the nurses who were transformed. The German soldiers in the wards, men who had been hardened by the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, watched the American logistical display with a mixture of awe and defeat. To these men, who had survived on frozen potatoes and shared single cigarettes among entire squads, the sight of an American medic casually dropping ice into a cup was a signal that the war was over in a way no treaty could ever describe. They were witnessing the arrival of a force that did not just conquer territory, but conquered the very environment of the battlefield. The wider impact of American logistics was a form of soft power that predated the term. Every interaction between the captor and the captive was filtered through the lens of this immense material superiority. When the Americans began to distribute fresh fruit and white bread to the German patients, it wasn't just an act of charity. It was an act of total systemic dominance. The German staff realized that the American machine was not merely a collection of factories in Detroit or Pittsburgh, but a living, breathing organism that could project the comforts of a distant continent into the heart of a ruin. This realization began to shift the internal dialogue of the German people from a fear of the victor to a deep-seated desire to understand the system that had produced such a surplus. In the camps and hospitals across the occupation zone, the story of the ice water became a shorthand for the American character. It was discussed in whispers as a miraculous phenomenon, a symbol of a nation that had so much energy and so much wealth that it could afford to freeze the very water it drank while the rest of the world burned. This transition from fear to awe was essential for the eventual rebuilding of a broken nation. The Germans began to see that the path to such abundance lay not in the rigid, destructive expansion of a single state, but in the collaborative, industrial might of a free people. For Greta and her colleagues, the ripples of abundance changed the way they viewed their own futures. They were no longer the guardians of a dying flame. They were the witnesses to a new sun rising. The Americans had demonstrated that the ultimate weapon of the 20th century was not the bomb or the tank, but the ability to care for the individual with a level of precision and luxury that had previously been reserved for kings. The clink of the ice in the canteen cup was the sound of a new standard being set for human existence, a standard where the measure of a nation's greatness was found in its ability to provide for its own, and even its enemies, with a generosity that bordered on the divine. The ripples of that cold water would eventually wash away the stains of the old world, preparing the soil for a new era of cooperation and shared prosperity. As the dust of the collapsing Reich settles into the fertile soil of the Elbe Valley, the schoolhouse turned hospital stands as a quiet monument to the end of an era. The transformation is complete. The heavy, oppressive silence of scarcity has been replaced by the vibrant, mechanical hum of a world that refuses to accept the limitations of nature. For Greta and the other nurses, the war did not end with a signature on a document in Reims or Berlin. It ended in the simple rhythmic vibration of their own hands as they held the gift of the victor. The ice water, once a miracle, has become a mundane reality, a constant companion in their daily rounds. It is no longer a shock, but a standard, a baseline for a life where the individual's needs are met with the full weight of an industrial giant's heart. The clink of the ice against the metal canteen cup has become the definitive sound of the new peace. It is a melody of logistical grace, a percussive reminder that the true strength of a nation is not measured by the territory it conquers, but by the comfort it can provide to the weary. The Americans did not just bring weapons to Europe, they brought the physical proof that a free society is an abundant society. They demonstrated that the decadence so loathed by the propaganda of the past was, in fact, a profound commitment to the human condition. To have ice in a wasteland is to have hope, to have enough to share is to have a future. The cold water was the first cleansing wave of a tide that would eventually wash away the wreckage of the 20th century's greatest tragedy. Looking back from the vantage point of a continent reborn, the encounter in that small German town remains a seminal moment in the history of human ideology. It was the point where the triumph of the will was decisively defeated by the triumph of the machine, and where the machine was revealed to be a servant of the people rather than their master. The nurses who once feared the arrival of the barbarians found themselves instead in the care of a nation that viewed every human life as a resource worth protecting with every tool at its disposal. The clinking sound was the funeral bell for a philosophy of suffering and the birth cry of a world built on the promise of plenty. In the end, the story of the German nurses and the American ice water is a story of the irresistible power of abundance. It is a reflection on how a single frozen cube can shatter a decade of lies and how a simple act of logistical surplus can act as the ultimate ambassador for freedom. As the sun sets over the now peaceful valley, the memory of that first freezing sip remains a testament to a larger truth, that the ultimate victory in any conflict is not found in the destruction of the enemy, but in the creation of a world where even the most humble prisoner can reach for a cup of water and find it cold. The clinking has stopped being a sound of war and has become the sound of a civilization that can finally afford to be kind.